The invisible host of Dothan. Prologue. The shadow war in the rugged hills of the ancient Near East. Around 850 BC, a war was being fought. But it was not a war of grand campaigns, sweeping battle lines, or sieges that lasted for months. It was a war of whispers, of shadows, and of frustration. King Ben-Hadad of Syria was a man accustomed to victory. His chariots were iron-shod wonders of engineering, his archers could strike a target from hundreds of paces, and his infantry moved with a discipline that terrified the smaller city-states of the region. He looked at the map of Israel with the hungry eyes of a predator. The northern kingdom, under its own idolatrous king Jeram, seemed ripe for the plucking, yet Ben-Hadad was losing his mind. For months, he had been playing a game of cat and mouse, where the mouse seemed to possess divine foresight. He would gather his generals in the dead of night, in the deepest recess of his royal tent, and whisper his plans. "We will strike at the pass near Aphek," he would murmur, tracing a line on the parchment with a calloused finger. "The terrain is narrow. We will bottle up the Israeli forces and crush them." His generals would nod, their faces grim with anticipation. They would mobilize under the cover of darkness, moving silently, efficiently. They would arrive at the ambush site, hearts pounding, weapons drawn, ready to spring the trap. And they would wait. Hours would turn into days. The sun would beat down on their iron helmets. The dust would settle, and the army of Israel, it would be nowhere to be seen. Or worse, reports would come in that the Israeli king had simply taken a different road, bypassing the ambush by miles, as if he had a map of Ben-Hadad's own mind. It happened once, and Ben-Hadad called it bad luck. It happened twice, and he called it a coincidence. But when it happened a third or fourth, a fifth time, the Syrian king's frustration curdled into paranoia. The atmosphere in the Syrian war camp became toxic. Generals eyed each other with suspicion. Guards were doubled, then tripled. No one spoke freely. The king paced his tent like a caged lion, his mind spinning with accusations. Finally, he snapped. He summoned his inner circle, the elite commanders, the most trusted advisors. The air in the tent was thick with tension. "Which of you is for the king of Israel?" Ben-Hadad roared, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Who is the traitor? Who is selling my secrets to the enemy?" The generals exchanged terrified glances. To be accused of treason by Ben-Hadad was a death sentence. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, a hesitant voice spoke from the back. It was one of the king's intelligence officers, a man who had spent time gathering rumors from across the border. "No, my lord, O king," the officer said, bowing low. "It is none of us." "Then how?" Ben-Hadad demanded. "Do the birds of the air carry my words? Does the wind whisper to Jeram?" "Not the wind, my lord, a man." The officer swallowed hard. "Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom." Ben-Hadad stopped pacing. He stared at the officer. The absurdity of it struck him first. A prophet, a religious mystic, was undoing the might of the Syrian army. But then, the logic settled in. It explained everything. It explained the uncanny timing, the impossible evasions. It wasn't a spy network, it was supernatural surveillance. The king's eyes narrowed. The nature of the war had just shifted. It was no longer a conquest for territory. It was a manhunt. "Go and see where he is," Ben-Hadad ordered, his voice cold and deadly, "that I may send and take him." Chapter 1. The target. The report came back swiftly. "Behold, he is in Dothan." Dothan. It was a name that meant little to the Syrian generals. It wasn't a capital city like Samaria or a fortress like Jerusalem. It was a secondary town, perched on a hill about 12 miles north of Samaria. It had walls, yes, but they were old and modest. It was a city of shepherds and farmers. famous mostly for its cisterns, the same cisterns where Joseph had been thrown by his brothers centuries before. It was an easy target. Ben-Hadad looked at the map. Elisha was trapped. The prophet had made a mistake. He had left the safety of the capital and exposed himself in this vulnerable, hilltop town. He thinks his God will protect him, Ben-Hadad sneered. Let us see if his God can stop a legion. The king did not underestimate his enemy this time. He knew he was dealing with power he didn't understand, so he compensated with overwhelming force. He didn't send an assassin, he didn't send a squad. He sent an army. Under the cover of a moonless night, the elite forces of Syria mobilized. The ground trembled under the hooves of thousands of horses. The iron wheels of war chariots crunched over the rocky paths. They moved like a dark tide through the valleys, bypassing villages, ignoring livestock. They had one objective: the old man in Dothan. They arrived before dawn. With military precision, they encircled the hill. Archers took positions on the surrounding ridges. Charioteers blocked the main roads. Infantrymen formed a ring of steel around the city walls. By the time the first grey light of morning touched the horizon, Dothan was sealed. A bird couldn't have flown out of the city without being spotted. The trap was shut. Chapter 2. The sight of fear inside the city. The morning began like any other. The roosters crowed. The smell of baking bread began to waft from the ovens. In the house of the prophet, Elisha's servant woke early. He was a young man, devoted but anxious, new to the service of the miracle worker. He had heard the stories: the oil that didn't run dry, the dead boy raised to life, the poisoned stew made safe. But hearing stories was one thing, living in the crosshairs of a superpower was another. He grabbed an earthenware pitcher and went to the door, intending to fetch water from the cistern. He unlatched the heavy wooden door and stepped out into the cool morning air. He stretched, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and looked out over the city wall toward the valley below. The pitcher slipped from his fingers and shattered on the stones. He blinked, sure that he was still dreaming, but the image didn't vanish. The valley, usually empty save for grazing sheep, was a forest of spears. The rising sun caught the tips of thousands of iron weapons, creating a shimmering sea of death. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath misting in the cold air. The distinct standards of the Syrian army fluttered in the breeze. They were everywhere: to the north, the heavy cavalry; to the south, the chariots; to the east and west, rows upon rows of archers. The silence of the army was more terrifying than a war cry. They were just waiting, waiting for him, waiting for Elisha. Terror, cold and sharp, gripped the servant's chest. He stumbled back inside, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. "Master!" he screamed, scrambling into the room where the old prophet slept. "Master!" Elisha sat up, rubbing his eyes. He looked at the young man, whose face was pale as death. "Alas, my master!" The servant cried, tearing at his clothes in grief. "What shall we do? We are surrounded. The Syrians, they are here. Chariots, horses, thousands of them. There is no way out." The young man ran to the window and pointed with a trembling hand. Elisha stood slowly. He walked to the window and looked out. He saw the gleam of the armor. He saw the grim faces of the Syrian captains. He saw the inevitable end that mathematics dictated to unarmed men against a legion. But Elisha didn't flinch. His pulse didn't quicken. He looked at the army with the same calm detachment one might use to observe a passing rainstorm. He turned to his servant. The young man was hyperventilating, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a hidden trapdoor. "Do not fear," Elisha said. His voice was steady, warm, and utterly incongruous with the situation. The servant stared at him. "Do not fear." Was the old man senile? Did he not see the swords? "For those who are with us," Elisha continued, "are more than those who are with them." The servant stopped breathing for a second. He looked around the small, dusty room. He looked at the frail prophet. He looked out the window again, at the encircling doom. There was no us. There was just them. Elisha saw the disconnect. He saw the spiritual blindness that was causing the young man's panic. He knew that explaining it wouldn't work. The boy needed to see. Elisha closed his eyes and raised his hands. He didn't pray for rescue. He didn't pray for fire to fall from heaven. He prayed for vision. Lord, Elisha said softly, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Chapter 3. The Mountain on Fire. The servant felt a strange sensation, like a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. The air in the room seemed to shimmer. He looked at Elisha, then turned his gaze back to the window. At first, the scene looked the same. The Syrian army was still there, menacing and dark. But then the veil tore. It wasn't that the physical world disappeared. It was that a greater reality was superimposed over it. The servant gasped, grabbing the windowsill for support. The barren, rocky hills around Dothan were suddenly not barren at all. They were crowded. They were overflowing. Above the Syrian chariots, standing on the ridges, floating in the air, filling every inch of available space, was another army. But this army was not made of flesh and iron. There were horses, but they burned with a white-hot intensity, their manes flowing like liquid fire. There were chariots, but they were forged from light, pulsating with a power that made the sun look dim. The riders were tall, terrible, and magnificent, clothed in armor that shone like lightning. It was the Mahanam, the host of God. The servant's eyes widened to the size of saucers. He looked down at the Syrian troops. They seemed small now, fragile, like toy soldiers made of clay. Their iron swords looked dull and brittle compared to the swords of flame held by the angelic host. The Syrians surrounded the city, yes, but the angelic army surrounded the Syrians. The besiegers were besieged. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. It wasn't just a protective detail. It was a legion of cosmic power. If one angel could destroy 185,000 Assyrians in a single night as history recorded, what could this multitude do? The universe itself seemed to vibrate with their presence. The servant looked back at Elisha. The old prophet was smiling faintly. He had been seeing this all along. He had woken up wrapped in this reality. To Elisha, the Syrian army was a minor nuisance. The reality was the glory of God protecting his servant. Do you see now? Elisha's eyes seemed to ask. The fear evaporated from the servant's heart, replaced by an awe so profound it bordered on terror. He wasn't afraid of dying anymore. He was afraid of the sheer magnitude of the holiness surrounding them. Chapter 4. The March of the Blind. The standoff on the mountain was silent. The fiery host did not attack. They did not rain down judgment. They simply stood, a testament to the ultimate authority of Yahweh. Then movement in the valley. The Syrian commanders, unaware that they were standing in the shadow of annihilation, gave the order to advance. The chariots rolled forward. The infantry began the climb up the hill toward the city gates. Elisha didn't wait for them to breach the walls. He walked out of his house, down the street, and through the city gates. He walked alone, an old man in a rough cloak, descending the hill to meet the most powerful army in the region. The Syrian soldiers must have paused. Was this him, the man they had come for? He looked so harmless. As they closed in, weapons raised, Elisha spoke. He didn't address the generals. He addressed God. Strike this people, I pray, with blindness. It wasn't a shout. It was a conversational request. And instantly, the world went dark for thousands of men. It wasn't a painful darkness, nor was it the darkness of night. The Hebrew word used suggests a confusion of sight, a dazzlement. It was as if their connection to reality was severed. They could see light, perhaps shapes, but they couldn't process what they were seeing. They couldn't recognize each other. They couldn't recognize the terrain. Panic rippled through the ranks. Horses reared as their riders yanked the reins in confusion. Soldiers stumbled into one another. The disciplined formation dissolved into a chaotic mob of groping men. "My eyes," someone shouted. "I cannot see the path." "Where is the commander?" another cried. Into this chaos walked Elisha. He stepped right up to the vanguard, to the men who moments before had been ready to put him in chains. "You are lost," Elisha announced, his voice projecting over the din. The soldiers quieted, turning their heads toward the voice. They were helpless, stripped of their primary sense. They were desperate for guidance. "This is not the way," Elisha said, lying with the truth. "And this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek." It was the ultimate irony. They were seeking Elisha, and Elisha was promising to take them to him. The Syrian commander, blind and disoriented, had no choice. "Lead us," he pleaded, and so began one of the strangest processions in military history. An unarmed prophet walked at the head of a column. Behind him, thousands of heavily armed soldiers stumbled along, holding onto each other's shoulders, leading their horses by the bridles. They walked away from Dothan. They walked south. They walked for 12 miles. The journey took hours. They marched through the heat of the day, trusting implicitly in the voice of the man they had come to destroy. They passed villages where Israelites must have watched in stunned silence the fearsome Syrian army, led like sheep by the holy man of God. Elisha led them through the valleys, up the ridges, and finally, through the heavy gates of a city. The soldiers heard the echo of their footsteps changing. They felt the cobblestones under their feet. They smelled the smoke of city fires. They assumed they had been led to a better vantage point, or perhaps a Syrian stronghold. Elisha stopped. The army halted, a mass of confusion packed into the city square. "Lord," Elisha prayed again, "open the eyes of these men, that they may see." The veil lifted, the confusion vanished. Vision snapped back into focus. The Syrian soldiers blinked, looking around. They saw walls. They saw towers. They saw soldiers, but not their own. Looking down from the ramparts, standing on the roofs, filling the streets around them, were the armies of Israel. Archers had their bows drawn. Spearmen had them encircled. They were not in a stronghold. They were in the middle of Samaria, the capital of their enemy. They had walked voluntarily into the belly of the beast. Chapter 5. The Feast of Peace. The silence in Samaria was absolute. The Syrians realized they were dead men. They had been delivered on a platter. King Joram of Israel looked down from his palace balcony. He could hardly believe his eyes, the bane of his existence. The army that had terrorized his borders was standing helpless in his courtyard. He turned to Elisha, practically vibrating with excitement. "My father, shall I kill them?" he asked. Then, realizing the magnitude of the moment, he asked again, "Shall I kill them?" It was the logical question. In the brutal calculus of ancient warfare, this was a gift. You do not release captured enemies. You execute them to ensure they never fight again. But Elisha looked at the king with a stern expression. "You shall not kill them," the prophet said. "Would you kill those whom you have taken captive with your sword and your bow?" Elisha was making a point. These men were not prisoners of war won by Jehoram's military prowess. They were captives of God. They were the Lord's prisoners, and therefore the Lord would decide their fate. "Set food and water before them," Elisha commanded, "that they may eat and drink and go to their master." Joram was stunned. Feed them. These men who wanted to burn his cities. But he looked at the prophet, the man who commanded angels and blinded armies, and he dared not disobey. The order was given. The tension in the square broke, replaced by confusion of a different sort. The Israeli soldiers lowered their weapons. Servants brought out bread, roasted meat, wine, and water. The Syrian soldiers, expecting the cold bite of steel, were instead handed warm bread. They ate tentatively at first, watching their captors. But as the meal progressed, the reality sank in. They were being shown mercy. Not the weak mercy of a coward, but the supreme mercy of a power so great it didn't need to kill to prove itself. It was a banquet in the presence of their enemies. When they had eaten and drunk their fill, Elisha opened the gates. "Go," he said. "Return to your master." The Syrian army marched out of Samaria. They still had their weapons, but they were disarmed in spirit. They had been defeated not by force, but by a display of sovereignty that left them shaken to their core. They returned to Ben-Hadad, not with Elisha in chains, but with a story that sounded like madness. They spoke of the fire on the mountain if any suspected it, the blindness, the long march, and the mercy meal. The biblical text records the aftermath simply. So the bands of Syrian raiders came no more into the land of Israel. The raid stopped. The shadow war ended. Ben-Hadad realized he could not fight a God who could blind his armies and then feed them lunch. Epilogue. The reality of the unseen. The story of Dothan is more than a military anecdote. It is a peeling back of the curtain that separates the physical from the spiritual. That morning, the servant learned a lesson that would define the rest of his life. He learned that reality is not limited to what can be touched, counted, or feared. He learned that the mouth of heaven is different from the mouth of earth. One man plus God is always a majority. The chariots of fire did not strike a blow that day. They didn't need to. Their presence was the point. They were there to assure the prophet and us that the resources of heaven are always deployed, always active, and always sufficient. Centuries later, in another garden, another man would face a mob of soldiers with swords and torches. His follower would draw a sword to fight, just as King Jerom wanted to strike. But Jesus would say, "Put your sword back into its place. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" The army of Dothan was there at Gethsemane, waiting in the wings, thousands upon thousands of fiery chariots ready to incinerate the Roman cohort. But Jesus, like Elisha, chose a different path. He chose not to unleash the fire. He chose to walk into the darkness, to let the enemy think they had won, so that a greater victory, a victory of mercy and redemption, could be won for all mankind. The lesson remains: we are never alone. The hills are full. The shadows are inhabited by light. And when we feel surrounded by the problems of this world, by the armies of fear and despair, the prayer remains the same: Lord, open our eyes, that we may see.